my privilege to introduce our speaker today, Professor Carol Izumi from University of California, Hastings College of the Law. I'm having to greatly abridge Carol's extensive and impressive CV for this introduction, so if you'd like to know more about her, I encourage you to look at her faculty profile. Carol serves as a director of Hastings Mediation Clinic and ADR Externship Program. She is also the faculty advisor for the Asian Pacific American Law Students Association. Before coming to Hastings, Carol was a full-time faculty member at George Washington University Law School and directed the Consumer Mediation Clinic and Community Dispute Resolution Center project. I knew Carol by reputation long before I met her in real life as a highly regarded clinician and scholar. The piece that forms the basis of her talk today, which is called Implicit Bias and the Illusion of Mediator Neutrality, is an extraordinary article that came out well before the mainstream interest in implicit bias that we see now in our society. Mediation is not my primary area of practice or research, but the values of mediation, neutrality, self-determination, and informed consent are relevant in all areas of ADR and in many areas of legal and political practice. So the article and this talk today are illuminating to everyone, not just mediators. Anyway, quickly back to the article. In that article, she writes that, quote, realistically, pure impartiality cannot exist in a mediation setting. That said, we should not abandon neutrality as a goal, end quote. I like this statement a lot because it summarizes what the ADR Center has been seeking to do with our programming this entire year. Recognize that implicit bias affects all of us, and therefore we must reject a simplistic understanding of neutrality. But then, instead of just bemoaning that we are inevitably and unavoidably biased, we should then recommit ourselves to striving to create processes and cultivate attitudes that are as clear-eyed, as multivalent, as nuanced, and as unbiased as we can make them. I'm very grateful that Carol is here to share with us her experiences in this regard, and I invite you to ask questions and share your own ideas and experiences after she talks. And for those of you who are watching the live stream, welcome. You can email me any of your questions or comments at jwr@uoregon.edu. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Carol Izumi.
Thank you, Professor Reynolds, for that lovely introduction, really. And I want to thank everybody at kind invitation to be here to talk about implicit bias and mediator neutrality. And also, I want to congratulate the ADRC on a 9th Circuit ADR Education Award, so well-deserved. So before we get into this topic, I want to issue a few caveats and disclaimers, like a good lawyer does. So number one is I am not a social scientist. We have a social scientist in the room to whom and also, you know, Professor Gervin's research is really illuminating and full of good science. So I would commend you for a little bit more robust scientific discussion. Also, a University of Missouri social scientist, Dr. Laura, I want to say Schurer. So Dr. Schurer, if you're watching, sorry if I just blew your name, but she does a crisp, concise, scientific analysis of implicit bias, and she gives you all these experiments and that kind of stuff. So I am not going to do that. The second little caveat is that my orientation to this subject comes as a clinical professor. So what that means is that in addition to thinking, my students are doing. So my students in the mediation clinic mediate small claims cases Monday through Thursdays. And on Fridays, we reserve that day to mediate discrimination complaints in the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. And public accommodations. And then the third say is that I I think we should all acknowledge that talking about race and talking about diversity, talking about discrimination, difficult. Try to have a discussion where you're curiously engaged with the topic, and that we can all something that happens to all of us. And as sort of rattling around in your brain doesn't necessarily mean you're racist, and it doesn't necessarily, it happens to all of us. Technology. I can barely use paper and pen, but I don't do PowerPoint, so I write things on the board. I also gave you an outline. My students like to have an outline just so I ban laptops in my classroom. Yes, I do. And so I write things on the board, and I really wanted this to be more interactive, like a classroom kind of environment than this, you know, sort of one-dimensional presentation style. Okay, so Professor Reynolds mentioned a little bit about my article. I did bring and so I have these on my shelf, and I'm actually trying to get rid of them. So please take one so I don't have to carry it back to San Francisco. So the article in great detail, but I did want to sit these key values, ADR and mediation. So when I looked at mediator neutrality in the article, what I did was I sort of researched, you know, what into that. And so I broke it down into 4 main components. Interest. So no financial interest, relational, affiliation, anything self-interest. Yeah, we all understand that. Fairness. So we know that having an even in buy into it. Outcome neutrality, which means that we as the neutral aren't steering or directing or cajoling people into the preferred outcome. Fourth component is that mediators should be conducting a process that's free from bias and favoritism. Okay, so that's how we enter this discussion. So when we think about freedom and favoritism, I want us to make a distinction between external neutrality and neutrality. All right, so external neutrality is what happens outside my body, in the room, in the mediation room. It happens in the process. And external neutrality, those are just aspects that we do, orchestration of the process to make sure it's even-handed. Things like equal amount of time, calling on people one by one, that kind of thing. All right, so we're not going to talk about external. How does the media inform judgments and make decisions about actions and people internally? Understand this. Discrimination, explicit bias, and implicit. Implicit is just a synonym for unconscious, okay? So I'm going to really simplify the focus of today, which is what do we do about all this? You know, it's kind of doom and gloom if you hear about implicit bias and how it operates. We want to have hope. We want to know there are things we can do about it. All right, so explicit bias are discriminatory biases that operate consciously. Okay, we know about these and we endorse them. So history, American examples that you can think about, and I call on students in my class to give examples of explicit bias. So one example they always throw out there about explicit bias from our own history is slavery, okay? So there's a situation where there's a conscious endorsement of discriminatory views and actions toward a particular social group, okay? So just quickly, can somebody give me just another example of explicit bias? What's another example from American history where we treated people differently? Sir?
Sure.
And I just saw 2 exhibits in Portland related to those 2 things. There's a great photography exhibit at Portland Art Museum on stereotyping Native Americans, and there's a wonderful exhibit at the Oregon Historical Society on the internment of Japanese Americans. So good. All right, so want to talk about the main course of the day. Implicit biases are these sort of hidden biases that operate in our brains. They're unconscious. We don't even know. These could be completely disavowed. We don't believe in these, but they exist in our heads. All right, so that sort of takes us up to about a third of where we want to go. So you might be wondering, well, how does this even happen? How could we possibly be influenced by things that we don't even know about? They don't even sort of register consciously. Well, here's how we know about this. The science of implicit social cognition has been examining mental processes that operate in here outside our awareness. And this has been going on, I don't know, Eric, like 30 years or something like that. And not only do these mental processes operate without our awareness, this is the really scary part. They unconsciously influence our judgments about people, our decisions, and our actions. All right, so they're operative in here and they affect unconsciously the way we deal with the world. So why does this happen? Well, it happens because of a phenomenon that is hardwired in our brain, and that's categorization. And so I enlisted, actually, I just sort of made them do this. I found 3 early arrivers who are going to be volunteers. And so they have these little round orange things in their hands. And so this is an exercise I do with my class to illustrate categorization. This is a basketball, right?
Right.
Right. You're not a volunteer. All right, so let's I've got Jennifer, Heather, and Gordon. Jennifer, Heather, and Gordon, you have this in your hand. Is this a basketball? No, Gordon, you're so smart. I love you. This is not a big, you know that.
It's too small.
It's too small. Okay, it's too small. Okay, so, and what else?
Edible.
It's edible. Okay, so basketball. Heather, what else? It doesn't bounce, right? Okay, so you'd think if you minor from mid-court. He's sitting there going, "Is this a basketball?" Has to take shortcuts. All right, so the point is we categorize all the time. Categorize not just things, but we categorize people. In fact, within a fraction of seeing a person, put that person into a box. And you also identify that person by gender and age. So when you saw me, you know, you bring in your burrito and you look thinking, oh, there's a white teenage boy. No, I don't think so. Right? So we're doing this very quick within a fraction of a second. Another thing brains are hardwired to do called in-group bias. What does that mean? Our own group, our own racial group, our own gender group, our own religious group. We have a strong preference for our group. And the research shows that you have that strong preference even when the groups are arbitrarily assigned. So if I made this half of the room ducks, and I made the other half of the room warriors, you would start to develop very strong in-group bias. Really assigned groups. Okay, following me here? So a phenomenon that makes this happen is that we start stereotyping about the major social groups when we're kids. This happens very early on in our development. In group bias, they've done experiments that show that infants as young as a few months old show a preference for their own racial group. So this is really in us deeply, automatically. So as we stereotype early as kids, one of the things that implicit bias research shows us is there are implicit attitudes. Again, unconscious stereotypes and unconscious and things that don't even register as conscious awareness. And I think of them as just sort of ripples in our head from media, from our family situation, from societal influences. So to me, it's sort of like this mental debris that's up there. And all this forms the basis of this phenomenon we call implicit bias. Implicit stereotypes, they have discovered, are automatically activated. They're automatically triggered by encountering a person. So when I see a person, what's going on in my head is these implicit stereotypes are automatically triggered. They call that automaticity. It's this phenomenon that creates the foundation for implicit bias. So the definition that we make based on these unconscious stereotypes. Okay, so everybody with me? Okay, yeah, good. You finished your burrito, you're awake, you're nodding, that's good. Okay, eating makes you happy. Okay, so again, happens. You know, you're smart people, you're sitting there thinking, wait a minute. These well, the research in implicit social cognition has been accelerated and advanced to aid our understanding of a particular research instrument, and that's called the IAT. And I bet you people in this room have taken the IAT. Who's taken the IAT? You go online, it's harvardimplicit.edu, and they have this whole menu selection association tests. And what of images and words. And the implicit association test is measuring the strength of those associations that you make. So the speed of your response on these pairings, you're hitting different keys on your keyboard. The speed of your response on these pairings, and you can't make deliberate choices. You have to act so quickly that that's how they're measuring this unconscious association. That gives you your implicit bias score. Okay, so the IAT has been taken now by millions and millions of people, 90% of whom are Americans. The most popular IAT is the race IAT. And the race IAT uses black faces and white faces and words that have good connotation and then words that have a bad connotation. And then they switch up. And so they're measuring, again, the strength of your response time on those pairings. So faster is equals favoritism. That's how it shows up. Of the millions of people who've taken the race IAT, something like 88% show an implicit bias in favor of European Americans over Blacks. And this type of favoritism, if you look at, for example, the youth IAT, again, there's a large percentage of test takers who show favoritism toward youth over the elderly. What's interesting about the age IAT is that elderly and young people both show that strong favoritism for young folks, okay? So that's helping us, this whole many thousands. So a meta-analysis of all of the science, all of the research, leads us to 4 big conclusions about this. Number 1, there's a between explicit cognition and implicit cognition. Okay, so let me give you an example on how that works. So take me. And I grew up with a bunch of Asian Americans around me. So it's time for me to take my first IAT. This is 2005, I think it was. All right. I should come out either neutral in terms of over European. I have in-group bias, folks. I should Asian Americans over European Americans, right? Right, that's what you would think. So I figure I'm going to start the IATs with one that I can do well. So I'm going to take the Asian American IAT, and I flunked. I had moderate preference for European Americans over Asian Americans. Now, how is that possible when the second conclusion is, of all this IAT research, we have, and I told you this earlier if you were paying attention, we have strong in-group bias. So how is it that I could flunk the Asian American IAT? What do you think? Anybody? How would that happen? Yes, Gordon, you're so good.
maybe your community that you were participating in was not predominantly academic community was not predominantly that.
Exactly. I grew up in St. Louis, and St. Louis does not have a large Asian American population. So while I, am at my home, I go to my school and it's me. Gordon's point, exactly, right? So it has to do with well, when I was growing up, dancers did not look like me. They didn't have legs this short, okay? And so what were my role models? So these kinds of influences also affect certain advantage social. For Asian Americans, but implicitly, it's inverse. All right, I mentioned number 2. Okay, the third conclusion that's drawn from all this research is implicit cognitions, more than explicit, predict behavior. So they did a couple experiments, and this is particularly important for those of us who do mediation. The research showed that those with higher implicit bias had more discriminatory behavior, spontaneous discriminatory behavior toward people, like blinking, not giving eye contact. Three heavy-duty conclusions, but here's the good news, and that takes us to ultimately where we really want to go. Implicit bias is not impervious to change. Okay, so we can actually do something about all of this stuff. So the reason that we think number 4 is, while it turns out that implicit stereotypes are automatically triggered, that automaticity I was talking about, stereotype activation is automatic, but stereotype application, actually applying that stereotype in our interaction with people and in our behaviors, that is a controllable process. So that is the good news, and that leads us to really the heart of our discussion today. So what can we do about it? What should we try to do? What are some concrete plans that we can develop? So now I want to talk about what the research suggests and how we try to operationalize this in one particular program, and that's my mediation clinic. And like I said, I'm just a lawyer with a little bit of knowledge. I'm just trying to help my students grapple with this because it's very unsettling for us. If you're a low prejudiced, egalitarian thinking person, the idea that you would interact with members of the public, that you would be unconsciously having these discriminatory thoughts, and those thoughts are influencing your judgment behavior, that's very fearful. And so, my students, whenever they always try to fight it. They don't really want to that it's a valid test. Talk about that. The research shows that you need 3 major implicit bias reduction to happen. The first, be very intentional. You have to have more than of that intention. The first one, unless you know that a problem exists. So many educators, judicial programs, lawyer education programs, CLE type programs, you know, they're starting to teach implicit bias to youngsters. So this awareness of the phenomenon exploded. When I started looking at it really wasn't on people's radar. Now everybody's talking about implicit bias. Google was in the news. You know, you're probably aware of the tech industry, heavily male. It's something like, I want to say 86% male. That might be incorrect. Heavily male. Google is people, and for a lot of their engineers, all right, awareness. So the way we increase awareness in our program is, again, I make all my students take the IAT. We discuss it. We know okay, it's not something to be embarrassed about. And if we normalize it and just talk about it very openly, that's going to help on the second part, and that's on motivation. So once you're aware, now you've got to be motivated to do something about it. Research shows that you need two types of motivation, internal and external. So the internal motivation is that I want to know that I want to know that internally of myself. That's internal motivation. I just want to please me. External motivation, you think of me as low prejudiced and as an egalitarian person, all right? So you have to have both internal and external motivation to actually operationalize debiasing. Motivator is using discrepancy experience is when you catch yourself. You just all of a sudden realize you had a thought or you had this subtle act that shows that you are thinking and acting egalitarian. Example from my own experience that and I drive down this street and I'm watching Hayes Valley, and it's a very hip neighborhood. Great place to visit if you come. So I'm watching this building come up, and it's got colors and glass and really nice hip addition to the neighborhood. A lot of young people, maybe even, you know, I don't know if my students can afford it, but nice. One day I drive by and they're putting on the name of the building. And the name of the building is, it's the Mary Rod self, thinking, oh my God, a bunch of old people are going to be living there. And I thought, oh my, I actually think this, and I did. And I caught myself having this view of old people don't deserve that building. So you know what I did? I went and I took the age IAT, because I think of myself as being neutral or actually liking older people more than, frankly, I like you young people. You know, to be perfectly honest, I'm sometimes contemptuous of you all. That's just the way I am. So I'm transparent about it. So I thought, okay, so I'm gonna take the age IAT, and again, I'm gonna ace it because, you know, I don't like young people. So it's gonna show that I have a course, I'm one of those people who has that bias in favor of you. Things like that to motivate yourself. If you pay attention, you will catch yourself. All right? All right. So now you're aware. Now you're motivated. You're going to use your discrepancy experiences. Well, the research says, okay, you can't just say, okay, I'm egalitarian all the way. You have to have an action plan. And an action plan has to be very specific, and it can't just be, oh, you know, if I run into a gay person, I'm not going to be homophobic. It can't be that. It can't be that generic. It has to be, if X happens, I will do Y. So how do we do that in the mediation clinic? Share these in class during what we call rounds, where we talk about mediations. And I do want to share one before I move on to action plan. My students shared one. They brought this to the attention of the whole class. So 2 of my students, a male and a female, when they go to small claims court, they have to talk to all the different what we call self-represented litigants who show up at small claims court, and they're waiting for the doors to open. And so, you know, about a half the students who are on duty that day to offer mediation services go and talk to all these folks who are sitting on benches in the hallway. "24 people in the hallway that day. So the students with each other, like, oh, did you talk to them? When they reconvened and they checked in with each other, that guy is blind. So the students that we hit everybody in the hallway but the blind guy. Was it intentional? Did they purposely mean to exclude him from their conversations? No. But they offered to the class that perhaps what was going on in their little brains was, ooh, maybe he's going to be harder to communicate with. Or maybe it's going to make the mediation kind of awkward when I have to explain the confidentiality agreement. So that was a student discrepancy experience that they shared with the class. Okay, so let's go back to action plan. So how would you incorporate an action plan in your activities? So this is how my have a Human Rights Commission discrimination complaint, which protected anti-discrimination laws work, as you know, probably, is that there are protected classes who are protected against discrimination, right? So we have knowledge ahead of time. Okay, so we are going to mediate a Human Rights Commission complaint involving a transgender person who wants to have things done at the workplace, okay, because she's getting harassed. So, and in an action plan, which is actually called an implementation intention plan in the research, that would translate like this. I'm going to mediate this case involving this transgender person. When I meet this transgender person or gender nonconforming person, I am going to remember to use the right pronoun. And I am going to remember to use that person's name when I refer to that person, okay? So you have to have a plan that actually is very specific about how you're going to behave. All right, so that's intention. The second required ingredient is attention. So in our clinic, we actually pay a lot of attention to attention. And one of the things we do before class every time, and our class meets Tuesday, Thursday mornings for 2 hours, we do mindfulness practice. Now, let me say, especially to those of you in Columbia, Missouri, I grew up in St. Louis, okay? I understand show me state skepticism. So when I came to Hastings, my co-teacher was doing this mindfulness meditation. And I was like, oh, this is so California, like hippy dippy granola. I cannot believe this, right? And I was totally skeptical, even though I had read some of this. Riskin, who's an ADR scholar, introduced this concept of mindfulness to the ADR community many, many years ago. And I actually tried it and I said, Len, I can't do this. I just can't do this. And so now I have really become a convert. So now I understand from reading that literature is scholarly practice, regular mindfulness practice on awareness, attention, focus, stress reduction, the ability to be present, and the ability to just understand your feelings and emotions. And it turns out the students love it. And in fact, they start leading some of the meditations themselves. And so through So the way check-ins work is students try to develop a habit when they're mediating. And in the midst of this conflict that's going on in the room, they're checking in with, this person's given me gas. Feeling really frustrated. I am feeling like I don't like this party anymore. And wow, so what we're trying to do with mindfulness is to make them get in touch their mediation. For my students, feeling a lot of 9%. And this is they were there for 5 hours at the Human Rights Commission. So they were feeling a high sense of frustration, and they just had to take a lot of breaks to deal with that. Another aspect of paying attention, bless you, is salience. So what does salience mean? So the research shows that we are more likely to engage in non-discriminatory behavior if we make race issues salient, i.e. conspicuous. So instead of just saying, oh, I'm colorblind, or oh, I don't have any bias, we really face it, that there are these biases. Have racial categorization going on and all these stereotypes being activated. So you want to make it salient, conspicuous, a part of regular discussion. And so we look and we try to understand, oh, you thought so-and-so was more credible? Does that have anything to do with the fact that that person has an Arab last name. Let's think about that. What did you find make it conspicuous? And last but not least, the third big piece that you need for your debiasing work is effort. You have to put effort into it. So I broke this. One is social contact theory. Okay, you probably know this, right? It's the fact that you are interacting with diverse helps reduce bias. And in fact, relationships you have, friendship, this kind of interracial friendship in San Francisco, it's very diverse. It's easy at my law school, it's very diverse. That wasn't so easy, frankly, for me when I was living in St. Louis. It's just my community was not as diverse. And so if you're in a situation where the social contact isn't this, and they've got this fancy long term, but counter stereotypical exemplars are models of folks who represent a non-stereotypic entity. Okay, so for me, a counter stereotypic exemplar is Martin Luther King. Okay, so it's a model of someone who doesn't represent the typical stereotypes. And so the research says that you can use these exemplars to reduce your implicit bias. And you can also use positive images, okay? So positive, you can put photos. And people do. You can put photos in your classroom, which I've actually tried to do, but it turns out there's a whole bureaucracy about putting things up in the classroom. In my office, I have pictures of African Americans whom I admire. And so this is the counter stereotypical exemplar example that you can do for effort. So what we do for perspective taking and empathy, and I'm in some of the ADR courses, role-playing exercises. So this one famous experiment that was done, the researcher had the research subjects watch a clip of a movie. It's called Joy Luck Club, and it features Asian American characters. So they watch this 3-minute clip, and then they do some tasks, and then they take the IAT later, and it turns out that their implicit bias against Asian Americans is reduced. Okay, so that's empathy, where you try to understand that person. What would that person's feelings be about certain situations? You can do that through narratives and through stories. Also, by listening to people tell you what it's like for them as a first person. So when we do our discrimination complaints, we always ask the person, the complainant, well, help us understand what it's like for you, XYZ. Okay, so for a disabled person, well, tell us what it's like, you know, when the elevator doesn't work in your building and you're on the 4th floor and you can't go down the steps. How does that impact your life? What is that like for you to be stuck in your apartment and not be able to have the mobility to do your normal activities. Okay, so you can do things like that. I also try to bring in stories that I read about. So here's one from the New York Times. A pair of New Jersey store she goes to all the time, and she's wearing her headscarf. Just say under their breath, you know, these horrible things to her. You know, what and empathy. And then last but not least, one thing that you have to do all of this is you have to bring sufficient cognitive resources to bear. So an example of that would be, how many of you remember that story where Mel, he was driving home and the cops pulled him over and he just unleashed all this racial and I think it was anti-Semitic insults. Do you remember that story? So that really goes to this whole idea of having sufficient cognitive resources available. He's able to keep it together when he's not. Lack of sleep. Consumption and drugs, even being hungry and not having sufficient fuel in your system is going to impair your ability to act in a non-prejudiced way. So the point of all this is be aware of all this, use your intention and all your motivations, pay attention to what's going on with you. And I'm sorry, I talked way too much. But what are you doing in your classes? What are you doing in your own efforts for debiasing? Anybody? Our programs, are you all doing things? I want to hear what people are doing too. Yay, Jen! Okay, Jen and Aileen.
He says, just interrupt us from acting on them.
They interrupt us from acting on them. Very, very good question. Kind of activity, bias and Joan Williams does work in the professional area with gender bias, and she's doing a lot on what they call bias interruption. You have a question?
I had a question about the in-group bias, especially with children, and I wondered whether or not, I mean, do the children adopt a bias in favor of themselves or the people they're around? So I'm thinking about perhaps a child of one race or ethnicity who's adopted by another. So what the child sees is A, and what the child is B. Which one is the bias that develops?
Yeah, well, so that child's in-group is probably going to be, let's say for Korean, there was a big activity around Korean adoption. Parents are adopting the Korean kids. So that child's in-group is going to be here. So there was an experiment that was done where children were shown pictures of white faces and Asian faces, and some were smiling and some had neutral expressions. So the American kids associated white face smiling more often. They did the same experiment in Taiwan with the opposite result, where the Taiwan kids had an association of Asian face equals smiling. So some of that goes to, like, where are you? What's the cultural situation? Yes, over here.
That kind of leads to a comment that I wanted to make, which is I understand your point about categorization being, I hate the term hardwired personally, but about being kind of a technique that we reach for. But when you building on what Professor Harris said, that when you said infants do this categorization, I kind of thought, well, if an infant can't recognize itself in the mirror, then how does an infant know what the infant is? Only by what the infant is exposed to. And so I guess the point I would make is that we may be hardwired, but how the categories are described is not hardwired. There isn't really such a thing as one race, two genders.
Right, because they're socially constructed.
Right. And so it looks up and sees and thinks of as itself.
Kids as young as several months old were indicating a preference for their own racial group.
The only ones I'm aware of, and a couple of them like that, the designs are always around parent. At least I'm aware of. I don't know of a cross-racial adoption study.
I don't know about a cross-racial adoption study either.
Yeah, the parents' preference for their parents' race.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question around the salience. When you said that the issues, right? The last name that might about eliciting a strong defense, because that would be really tricky to how do you do that?
So sometimes it takes place in debriefs. Yeah, so the mediation's already done. Or if co-mediator breaks. Yeah. And my students mediate in pairs of 2, and I'm an observer. And so if I'm observing something, or if the students take a break, I might ask them, so we'll do that kind of a check-in thing I was talking about. And sometimes they will offer it up, like, well, I just don't believe so-and-so. And then we just try to tease that out. Well, what is it that you find makes the other person more credible? And it might be, well, she can explain herself more clearly. She's more articulate. And objective measures that they're using to decide who they find more credible, or just basically who's more likable. Once we start to unpack that a little bit, they start to wonder, oh yeah, maybe that's that professionalism bias that we have as lawyers, or as, gonna be. There are a lot of different biases that can operate. Yeah, thank you for that. Other questions? Yeah, Jen.
I can imagine, just building on what Jen was talking about, in a practice context, in debrief, you could talk really openly about the bias you might have felt, or that you might be experiencing, or how it might be operating. But if you're in the mediation or in some sort of situation with a client, and you think that they might be exhibiting bias, unconscious bias, probably not going to be very easy to name that too directly. And
right.
So, even so, in the work I've done, mediating or conflict, I'm just talking much more general. In some ways you can talk about assumptions instead of bias.
Right.
And super specific about the individual. And so trying to, so you either get away from the talk of bias, which I think could be kind of entrenching to the person if brought up kind of out of the blue.
Yeah.
But it's, especially because it's experienced implicitly, so they're not even perhaps aware. But if you, in terms of assumptions, and then work through it that way, or in terms of what does this individual actually have to deal with, and try to get them to see the person not necessarily as a set of categories, but as somebody who has, I guess this is the use of empathy, perspective taking empathy.
Right,
as
right.
really good strategies for that.
Yeah, and we don't even, I'll be honest, like all of these strategies, this is just what we do with the students. sitting in the mediator chair. So we don't even try to think about how you would help debias the parties in the room, because they're so much trickier. So I think a lot of it with the parties is more of the perspective taking, and also just, again, getting into their interests and trying to understand what is motivating them generally. Yeah. But you can't sit there and talk about implicit bias with, And I think that's one of the who are doing this work, for example, in the courtroom. Judges, there's a lot of programs, implicit bias program for judges. Actually operationalizing that in jury selection is a huge challenge. How would you have, in a voir dire, the time to try to even get into that? The judges are trying to sort of, I think, how they make decisions first, because that's the easier thing to tackle, is our own actions. But this is all tricky business. It is. Yes.
Yeah, so when I was teaching the small claims mediation clinic, I think the debiasing practice is somewhat similar to, I would say, the sort of overall pedagogical goal of teaching them to be neutral in many ways, right? So helping them understand that the person sitting in front of less experience and whatever it is, whatever your initial impression of the person is. So one of the things we did was that we made a giant list of all the judgmental, mean things that people would think, like, okay, well, if you have that thought when you're mediating, sort of like a mindfulness that we mentioned, like how do you respond to that assumption? Like, what might actually be going on that's more complex for this person? Why might their perspective actually be reasonable? And also, the ultimate outcome and what they ultimately learned was different than their initial impression, so that they have an actual experience per your discrepancy experience. They have wrong, so they're better interrogating their original initial impressions based on whatever categories they have to assign.
Yeah. And so sometimes if we do a mediation and there's no agreement, we go back into small claims court and we watch the trial. And so they already have assumptions like, loser, right? Right. And then all of a sudden, the judge makes a decision, or they can sort of tell with, and they were so wrong. Yeah. And so that's, yeah.
So I was a little bit curious. The race of their parents. I'm curious about how that. People. The implicit association test. Because I remember in Professor Gervin's class we talked about the African American children and the white children, say that like the African American looking doll is bad and the white one is good.
So Eric, help me here. So my recollection is that there were the studies show that you start discriminating. So in-group bias happens at a young age, right? But as we get older, we don't actually discriminate in the way we think about negative discrimination until we're older. And some of those studies indicate that it's like preteen years. There was that's for Americans. They also did a study in Japan. So do you want to elaborate on that?
I'm thinking through the order, right? 5, 6, 7-year-olds tend to be pretty explicit when talking about race and group differences and other things, or they haven't learned the taboo portion, right, or social sensitivity piece of it yet, and so that can affect things. one thing we talked about with adult studies is, although the idea was that everyone had an group bias, and so that could be put into sort of ethnocentrism, but that gets disrupted potentially by status differences. And people tend to form preferences for the highest status group in their society, unless they have a lot of, basically a lot of in-group bias. The idea that if it's, think of like Black Power movement or something like that, where people, unless they adopt my group, it's awesome, even though we're not high status and overtly of race.
Americans are the only racial group that doesn't have that the European bias, right? Yeah. And I think that the discrepancy kids get into more like preteen years or what I consider to be like middle school years is where the explicit implicit really starts to become more noticeable, right? Yeah. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned the tech industry and the figures around the gender breakdown. And so some of the companies, they all offer referral bonuses. And some of them, they've been offering 54 times that bonus to refer a female employee or potential employee or male. Would you just like to see that issue corrected across the board, with just having a better gender training so that it's more of a internal motivation, or are you okay with the external motivation of offering significantly more financial gains
bounties for years, right? So an engineer gets X amount of buku bucks for bringing in another engineer. So I mean, they've been doing bounties for a long time. But I do think that, you've got to look at, which is what Google's doing. So, they're really making an effort, so I, shared this with my students, all the stuff that's going on because everybody cares so much about tech in San Francisco, all the things that money to get more diverse engineers. And they're also doing all kinds of things with young girls, teaching young girls to code. And then also, though, not just doing, but all this, what's going on with the HR people? At resumes and the assumptions that they make. If it's, if it says Kate Smith versus John Smith on the resume. So that's where they're doing a lot of the work. Okay, are there questions?
We have time for one more question.
Yes.
One of the things that struck me as you were talking particularly about jurors and thinking about judges trying giving jurors tests and so forth, is that in many places in legal practice, and probably jury selection is the best, there's actually a premium put on being that. That's how you pick jurors.
Yep. People pay big money for that.
So, and the reason that's valuable is that some sense it works. So what do you do with that?
Well, what's interesting about profiling is, if you look at all the police activity and racial profiling, police chiefs and recognize how racial profiling is ineffective. And so it was really a lot of impetus for a lot of good work that's being done in police departments comes from the police themselves. Understanding how certain profiling just isn't really, it's over-inclusive and under-inclusive at the same time. So that these kinds of assumptions that we make really don't play out well. So I think what, the whole juror activity that's going on, what behavior you're getting at. So, there's been a lot written about jury selection and implicit bias, and it's actually in the criminal context particularly. And also about the role of defense attorneys and prosecutors as part of their work. And again, it's some of these shortcuts that people are taking. And it is really challenging. A lot of judicial programs now tools on sentencing. Are, African American are, goes to, again, all these assumptions and how you use the effort. And so in the bias interruption in the workplace effort, what people are trying to do is blind resumes, taking names off resumes, modeling behavior, what they did in I think it was the 1950s on auditions for symphonies and things, when they did the blind auditions. And so you couldn't tell if the cellist was male or female, and that's how so many more women got into the professional music area. So again, just thinking about little things that we can do that take away the opportunity to make shortcuts instead of really being deliberate about how decisions are made. I think that's where we're going to see more improvement, maybe in the jury selection or the criminal justice area or some of these.
I'd say there was at least a debate for a while, I guess probably still ongoing, about whether high-end jury consulting was a solution to implicit bias in selection. I guess it can be much more differentiated than the off-the-cuff lay wisdom of the prosecutor or defense attorney to actually get metrics that are better predictors of what you care about. The problem is that's really expensive. And that's
But it works. It's better.
It's better in the sense that you get a more differentiated. It's not the race is what we're using to predict. It's a lot more robust set of predictions.
Yeah.
A really fascinating example of this, I don't know how many of you watching the OJ story on FX, but it's been an incredible view and losing both explicit and implicit bias in jury selection. And so,
Oh, really? This new show?
it's a miniseries on FX that's dramatizing the OJ Simpson.
Yeah, I've read about it, but I didn't know that. Yeah, they're going into the.
Classic examples of jury consulting.
And they just ignore it.
If I remember correctly, both sides. The assumption was that so you have somebody. The prosecutor's assumption was that defense jury consultants told them that African American women would not be that way, and the prosecutors fired the jury consultants, and the jury, if I remember, was disproportionately African American women.
Well, thank you so much.
Interesting.
Thanks for having me.
Oh. Thank you. That was fun.
Thank you so much.
That was very.